Good morning, guys. I thought today we might do a little bit of revision work on a topic that I know many of you don't like, guys, which is the pursuit of sovereignty and the impact of partition. So that part of Irish history, and the idea here is to kind of improve your knowledge on this, guys, give you more of a rounded knowledge to help you with any questions that do come up on this topic. Yeah, just have a look at the table of contents, guys. This is it as far as the course goes. It can be broke down into essentially 9 different sections. And remember, you get 4 questions in your exam in June. So to have 9 sections and 4 questions, very, very good options here. So it even helps if you focus on 3 or 4 topics and know them really, really well. So from Ireland 1912 to 1916, essentially Ireland and the road from Home Rule essentially up to the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, the treaty negotiations, which is a case study, the Civil War, which is a nice short one, Coming in Yale, the Irish Free State, Fianna Fáil in power, Ireland during World War II and the years after, and then you have 2 Northern Irish topics. Remember, Northern Ireland comes up a lot, guys, in the exam. They're not the most enjoyable topics, but it does come up a lot. That's separate from Northern Ireland. We're doing it as on its own course, but. And what we're going to be looking at today, guys, is from Home Rule to the rise of Sinn Féin. How do we get from a promise of Home Rule to Sinn Féin coming from nowhere and doing so well in the election of 1918? So firstly, to know where Home Rule originates from and how we got so close to it, essentially you can all link it back to this man here. So he is Wicklow's famous child. He's Charles Stuart Parnell from Rathdrum. He got Ireland to within touching distance of Home Rule. And actually he would have got Home Rule were it not for an affair he was actually having at the time. That kind of ruined his career. But what Home Rule means, guys, okay, so it is useful to know the definition of it. It's a limited form of Irish independence. It's not full independence by any stretch of the imagination. Ireland would be in charge of domestic affairs, so running of schools, running of hospitals, etc. But Westminster, London would still control the external issues, so the main issues, so taxation, foreign affairs, etc. It's a little bit like what Scotland has today. Scotland's still a part of Britain today, but they have a small bit of devolution power, which means a small bit of power, essentially like Home Rule. Now, most nationalists in Ireland, most Republicans, most people in Ireland were in favour of Home Rule after 1900. They wanted Home Rule. But Unionists were horrified by the idea of Home Rule. They were disgusted by it. Remember, Unionists tended to be Protestant and tended for the most part to live in the north of the country. At this time, guys, there was no such thing as Northern Ireland. It was just Ireland. There was no state as Northern Ireland. Now, we'd had Home Rule, which had been introduced twice, but it failed in 1886 and in 1893. Both times the first time blocked by the House of Commons, later by the House of Lords. A new rule had been brought in that meant that if it's brought in again, it'll be the 3rd time, it can't be blocked by the House of Lords. This means that if it's brought in again, it will become law. Now, 1912 is when it did become law. So the Prime Minister this time was Prime Minister Asquith. And he was the leader of the Liberals. Now, the Liberals tend to be the party that were in favour of Home Rule, that were open to the idea of giving Home Rule. The other party were the Conservatives. Now, there was no real Labour at this time. The other party was the Conservatives, who were not really in favour of Home Rule. So the Liberals in 1912 introduced the 3rd Home Rule Bill. That meant it was to become law. Now, passed in the House of Commons, got through the House of Commons, and thanks to the Parliament, 1911 Parliament Act, which we'll talk about in a second, it would become law by 1914. So the Parliament Act's in the yellow box down here. It meant the House of Lords could no longer veto a bill if they'd done it twice already. So veto means stop something. The House of Lords stopped Home Rule twice. They couldn't do it a 3rd time, so they can't delay it anymore. They can only delay it for 2 years at the max. It has to become law then. So Ireland knew at this point, we're going to get Home Rule, because the only the obstacle to Home Rule was the House of Lords. That was now essentially removed. But once it became apparent we were going to get it, the Unionists, particularly up in the north of the country, started to get a campaign together. Now, they were led by 2 men called Carson and Craig. Staunchly Unionist men who firmly believed in the idea of keeping the link with Britain. So their catchphrase at the time was Home Rule would become Rome Rule, that the Catholic Church would have full control in Ireland and Protestants would not be welcome at all. And they didn't want that. On top of that, Belfast was thriving at this time. There was a fear that Ireland, being relatively backward, would affect Belfast, and Belfast needed that link with Britain. But anyway, the Ulster Unionists under Carson and Craig organised anti-Home Rule campaign. So they did that in a couple of different ways. The first way was a legal way, the Solemn League and Covenant, which you can see down there in the picture. Solemn League and Covenant was basically like a charter that every unionist signed in Northern Ireland, some with their own blood, that said they did not want to be a part of a Home Rule Ireland. They wanted to stay part of Britain. And then you have the UVF, the kind of illegal party. So the UVF stands for the Ulster Volunteer Force. So they were a group who were willing to take up guns in order to make sure there was no Home Rule. Now, in response, in the Republic of Ireland, Owen McNeill set up a new group called the Irish Volunteers, and they were a group who would again take up guns to make sure Ireland would get Home Rule. So you're getting close to what's essentially going to be a civil war here. A civil war here, guys. You have Unionists in Northern Ireland set up the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, and in Ireland we've set up the Irish Volunteers. So the road seems to be set for Irish civil war. So Ireland was headed towards civil war, so talks began to find a compromise. The bit in bold, guys, and anything that's in red here is very, very important. This bit is important. In 1914, you have what's called the Buckingham Conference, called by the King, and he invited all parties to take part in that, where to discuss what to do about Home Rule. And the Home Rule party went to it, well, probably shouldn't have. It kind of legitimised the idea of unionists being separate. Anyway, in August 1914, Home Rule was passed, but its operation was suspended. It wasn't put in place straight away, and we know why. For bad timing for Ireland. World War One was the start. So we'd got the promise of World War One. We got the promise of Home Rule, and Britain said, we will stick by our word. We passed Home Rule. Home Rule will come in once World War One is ended. Remember, World War One was a war they were convinced would end in 6 months. Everyone was convinced it would only be a short, quick war. It wouldn't last that long. It's only later the phrase came in, and it would be the war to end all wars. Anyway, guys, World War One kicks off. Now, we don't need to know much about World War One. Essentially, you can think of it as Germany attacking Belgium would start World War One, but mainly Germany, with help from other countries like Austria and Turkey, were fighting against Britain and France, and later you would have the Americans as well. Ireland were fighting alongside Britain. Obviously, we were part of Britain this time. Now, many Unionists showed their loyalty by straight away joining the British Army. So Unionists, who remember, were mainly in the north part of the country, all joined up with the British Army. Now, the Home Rule Party here was in a pickle. So the Home Rule Party is led by John Redmond. A man who's done great work for the party so far. And he had a decision on this mind here. What to do with the Irish Volunteers. They've got Home Rule promised. What do they do now? Do they kind of say, we're separate to Britain, we're not getting involved in World War One? Or do they say, no, at your time of need, we're going to fight alongside you? So he urged the Irish Volunteers to do the same as what the Unionists had done, and to join the British Army. He made a very famous speech in County Wicklow, the other side of County Wicklow, in Wooden Bridge, where he urged the Irish Volunteers to fight with Britain, show your loyalty to Britain, but also your determination to make Britain stick to their word at the end of the war. It led to a split in the Home Rule Party. Now, almost all, over 90% of the Irish Volunteers supported Redmond. So the majority did support Redmond, but a minority, so 11,000. Now, 11,000 out of some 180,000 is tiny, but a minority didn't, and they broke away, and they were led by McNeill. And they were completely against the idea whatsoever of helping Britain, of fighting alongside Britain, a country that we're trying to essentially leave. You also had a lot of members of that were members of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who would later become the IRA. James Connolly, who will come up a lot later on, he's kind of a trade unionist at this point, leader of the Labour movement. He was another outspoken critic. So you have this famous sign here, if I can move in. We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. Kaiser's leader of Germany this time. They're basically saying, we're not in favour of Germany, we're not in favour of Britain, we only serve Ireland, we care about Ireland. Now, as I said, guys, World War One is not key to really know what happened, but it was a horrific war fought in the trenches. The Irish were often front line, and we suffered terribly. Statistically, I think we had the most deaths per soldiers that were fighting of any country in World War One. So it was a horrific war, and you can imagine a war that's meant to last 6 months and you're fighting 3 years after it started, you get very, very tired, and the people who are in the war are getting very, very tired of it. Now, moving on, guys, it's linked to it as well. So the 1916 Rising, England's difficulty will be Ireland's opportunity. So it was planned by the Military Council of the IRB, essentially the same guys, the Irish volunteers, who didn't take part in World War One. So the group that broke away with McNeill. Now McNeill wasn't involved in this actually, but it was planned by Military Council. Those 7 men that you can see in the picture there, mainly Pádraig Pearse obviously being the key one, but other ones being Sean McDermott, Joseph Plunkett, Thomas Clark, etc. And they really firmly believed in this idea that England's difficulty, World War One, is Ireland's opportunity to get full independence. These men wanted full independence. They didn't want home rule. Home rule wasn't enough for them. And they'd also infiltrated McNeill's Irish Volunteers, so the group that we were talking about earlier on, who wouldn't get involved in the war. They felt like Germany was the best way to get guns, because Germany was fighting Britain. Germany would do anything they could to undermine Britain at this time. So Roger Casement, a leading Republican from Antrim at the time, he was sent to Germany to get help. And he did succeed. He got quite a number of arms for a rebellion. But he ended up being captured. We'll see a little bit later. He wasn't in Ireland for most of the war, but he played a big role in trying to get guns into the country. So the leaders, we know Pádraig Pearse and James Connolly would be quite different men. So Pádraig Pearse was a teacher, while James Connolly was a trade unionist. And James Connolly's group got involved as well, the Irish Citizen Army. Now, the IRB, who we're going to go through this, right, needed a full support of the 11,000 Irish volunteers. The 11,000 were the Irish volunteers who didn't take part in World War One, along with the Home Rule Party. So on the 19th of April, Joseph Plunkett forged a document called the Castle Document, stating the government was going to arrest the leaders of the IRB. This was to get McNeill to give the orders, so to tell his men. The idea with this forged letter, the Castle Document, was to get McNeill to get the volunteers involved in the Easter Rising. But then you've quite a bit of bad news coming very, very quickly then. Returning from Germany, Casement was arrested just off the coast of Kerry, and his ship called the Odd, with all of the guns, German guns on board, was scuttled. It was sunk. And this was a disaster for the Irish, because we had very, very shortage of weapons, and now the weapons we had coming to us were now at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But ironically, Casement was actually trying to stop the rising at this time, because he knew the arms he got from Germany were inadequate. They were not enough. They would not be all that useful against the might of the British army. But obviously he never got back to Dublin to actually say that. Also around the same time, Owen McNeill discovered the Castle Document telling the Irish volunteers were going to be arrested. He discovered it was a forgery. And he'd also learned about Casement being arrested and the ship with the guns being captured off the coast of Kerry. So he cancelled the plans for the rising to take place on Easter Sunday. Very, very famous newspaper heading. No parades. Obviously, they couldn't say no rising, because that would alert the British. So they were calling it a parade. No parade. Irish Volunteers March cancelled for Easter Sunday. And that was published in the newspaper. And that would create a mixed message here. So a few men and no new weapons, the rebellion was bound to fail. It was definitely 1000% going to fail. It was not going to win. But the people you're dealing with here didn't really care about that. They were willing to make a blood sacrifice. So the IRB decided they would go ahead with it anyway on Easter Monday. And the problem is here, it's getting word around, because a lot of the Irish volunteers had heard, the IRB members have heard from the newspaper, it's not happening. So they stay at home actually on Easter Monday. And this kind of gives a good insight into Pádraig Pearse's mind. So blood is a cleansing and sanctifying thing, and a nation that regards as the final horror has lost its manhood. There are many things more horrible than bloodshed, and slavery is one of them. Very, very strong words, but saying basically it's better to die than to be a slave to Britain. And Pearse believed in this blood sacrifice. He hoped that his death would inspire others to fight and die for freedom. Now, we know, guys, it was an absolute disaster, the Easter Rising, and 15,000 people got involved in it. They seized 7 strategic buildings throughout Dublin, so the GPO, the Four Courts, Jacob's Factory, etc. But they didn't take over the ports, they didn't take over the train stations, which made it very, very easy for the English actually to bring in numbers very, very quickly. At noon, the tricolour was raised over the GPO, and Pearse stepped out in front of the GPO and read the proclamation to bemused onlookers who didn't actually know what was going on at the time. And the British were slow to respond. It took them a couple of days. Eventually they did. A gunship called the Helga was brought up to Liffey, and that shelled the city and destroyed Sackville Street, or O'Connell Street as we call it now. And the rebels were defeated. The leader of the British Army at this time was a man called Sir John Maxwell. They defeated them within a week, which is probably longer than what most people would have thought the Irish would have held out, because they were sitting ducks, sitting in a building essentially waiting to be attacked. The picture on the left-hand side shows Padraig Pearse admitting defeat, essentially surrendering. So in total 450 people were killed, and most of them were civilians. 300 civilians were killed. 29th of April, so a little over a week, Pearse and Nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell. So Elizabeth O'Farrell is very famous for waving the white handkerchief to stop this, unconditionally surrendered to General Lowe of the British Army, which connects to the picture that I was talking to you about up there. And we know the stories. They had rotten veg thrown at them. They had abuse thrown at them from the Irish people, mainly the Irish women, who were disgusted. Their husbands, their boyfriends, their fathers, etc. were all fighting over in France for Ireland, and here were these men undermining that. And they got dreadful abuse and were hated by the Irish people. But then Britain made probably one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made in their history. They decided to execute the leaders. They were originally supposed to execute over 70, I think 72 was the full number. They'd executed 16 of them. Before the British realised this was getting them terrible publicity. So Pearse and Connolly were obviously executed along with a number of the other leaders, including some leaders that hadn't signed the proclamation. And most were killed in Kilmainham jail. One was killed down in Cork. But yes, they killed in the graveyard of, not in the graveyard, in the courtyard of Kilmainham jail. Now, up to that point, the people of Dublin had been very frustrated with the rebels and the damage that the rising had caused, but this led to Irish people to start to sympathise. They were discussing with these people, but then they thought, they're being shot for this, and stories started to come out. So, Joseph Mary Plunkett, for example, getting married the night before and getting no time with his wife. Stories like that came out, and it resonated with Irish people. And suddenly they started to think, maybe these men had an idea. Maybe this is kind of a wake-up call for Ireland. Roger Casement himself was put on trial in London, spoke very, very eloquently over there about the need for Ireland to be a republic, to have control of its own affairs. And he was hung over in England. And again, that disgusted Irish people. So 2,500 people were injured. £3 million worth of damage was done, which today is somewhere around €200 million. And Britain imposed martial law and interned 2,000 people. Now, 2,000 people didn't get involved in this, so a lot of people were locked up without trial that took no part whatsoever in this rising. And the British government called it a Sinn Féin rising, even though Sinn Féin had nothing to do with it, and that would become key in what we're going to be doing next day, guys. It became known as the Sinn Féin Rebellion, and this gave them publicity, particularly with the executions. So their popularity went through the roof due to the mistaken assumption that they were behind the rising. And that'll bring us on to the rise of Sinn Féin the next day. So just to show you an example, guys, of the question that can be asked. What were the main events in Dublin during the 1916 rising, and was Ireland, in Yeats' phrase, changed utterly as a result? Now, we'll go down to the bottom of the page, guys. You'll have this near one now, by the way. Open up the Pursuit of Sovereignty in the very first tab, number 1, Ireland 1912-1916. You'll see it there. And what I might get you to do, guys, is you don't particularly have to write these down. If you can just question them, I might be able to have a look at questions 1, 2, question. Question 15. Okay. Alright, guys, any questions, email me and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.